You've seen the eerie beaked mask of the plague doctor. But do you know why they really wore it? Today, we're diving into the weirdest and most shocking facts about plague doctors you've probably never heard before. Their beak wasn't just for looks. When you picture a plague doctor, the first thing that comes to mind is that eerie, bird-like beak. But what most people don't realize is that the beak wasn't just for dramatic effect. It was actually designed with a very specific purpose. In the 17th century, people believed that diseases like the Black Death were spread through poisonous, foul-smelling air called miasma. To protect themselves, plague doctors filled their mosque's beak with strong-smelling herbs, dried flowers, spices like cloves and cinnamon, and even vinegar-soaked sponges. These ingredients were thought to cleanse the air before it reached their lungs, like a medieval air filter. The beak could be up to half a foot long, and the longer it was, the more time they believed the air had to become purified. In some bizarre cases, they stuffed the beak with rotting substances like dried blood, crushed insects, or even decaying animal flesh. The belief behind this unsettling choice? Some thought that fighting death required masking it with an even stronger, more putrid smell. But rather than purify the air, these revolting additions likely turned the inside of the mask into a bacteria-filled chamber of horror, making the already dangerous job even riskier. They used leeches and toad paste as medicine. Plague doctors relied on some of the strangest and most disturbing treatments imaginable. One of the most bizarre was the use of leeches. Those slimy bloodsuckers were believed to draw out bad blood, which was thought to cause disease. But that wasn't the worst of it. In some cases, they also applied a revolting mixture made from crushed toads, sometimes mixed with herbs or even human waste, and smeared it directly onto the swollen buboes, the painful lumps caused by the plague. These so-called cures didn't help at all. In fact, they often worsened infections or led to other illnesses. But in a time when people were desperate for anything that might save them, even a toad-based remedy seemed worth trying. The cane wasn't for walking. Although plague doctors were often pictured with a long wooden cane in hand, it wasn't used for walking. It was actually one of their most important tools. The cane allowed them to examine patients from a distance, lift clothing to inspect buboes, and even point out instructions without ever needing to touch the infected directly. In some cases, the cane was used to prod patients who had collapsed, or to enforce quarantine by physically keeping crowds at bay. It also served as a psychological barrier, reminding everyone to keep their distance from both the doctor and the disease. Many were not real doctors. Despite the name, many plague doctors weren't actually trained physicians at all. In fact, during major outbreaks, cities were so desperate for help that they hired anyone willing to take on the deadly job: barbers, butchers, failed medical students, or even complete amateurs. These men were often given basic instructions, a frightening outfit, and sent straight into the heart of infected neighborhoods. Their role wasn't necessarily to heal but to document cases, count the dead, and offer what little comfort they could. Some could barely read or write but were still expected to keep medical records. Real doctors, especially those who served the wealthy, often refused to treat plague victims altogether, leaving the poor with no choice but to trust these desperate stand-ins in bird-like masks. Because so many plague doctors lacked proper training, their treatments were often based on superstition, like bloodletting, applying crushed emeralds, or placing dead animals on open sores. All of which, of course, did nothing to cure the disease. They sometimes performed autopsies. While many plague doctors were untrained and overwhelmed, some went a step further and performed autopsies, gruesome and risky procedures that were both rare and controversial in the medieval world. In a time when cutting open human bodies was often seen as taboo or even sinful, a few brave plague doctors dared to examine the dead in hopes of understanding how the disease worked. These early autopsies weren't done in sanitized labs. They were messy, unsanitary affairs often conducted in plague-ridden homes, church basements, or open fields. With no real tools beyond knives and their thick leather gloves, doctors cut open corpses to look for signs of the plague in the lungs, heart, or buboes. Although they lacked modern knowledge, these grim investigations laid the groundwork for later medical discoveries. They were feared as much as respected. While plague doctors were meant to be symbols of hope and healing, they often inspired fear more than comfort. Their dark, bird-like costumes made them look more like grim reapers than lifesavers, and their appearance usually signaled one terrifying truth: the plague had arrived. When people saw a plague doctor walking into town, they didn't run toward him for help. They ran away, knowing death wasn't far behind. Even children were taught to fear the beaked figure, whose visit might mean quarantine, forced removal of the sick, or the marking of a house for mass burial. Many believed that just being near a plague doctor could bring misfortune or even spread disease. So while their job was essential, their presence was both necessary and deeply unsettling. Some wore charms and amulets. Despite their intimidating appearance and protective gear, many plague doctors didn't rely solely on science, or what passed for science at the time. Some of them wore charms, amulets, and even religious relics under their robes or sewn into the lining of their coats. These items were believed to ward off evil spirits, bad air, or divine punishment. Common explanations for disease in the medieval world. A doctor might carry a piece of parchment with a sacred prayer, a gemstone thought to have healing properties, or a carved figure of a saint believed to offer protection from illness. While these trinkets had no real medical value, they provided a sense of comfort and psychological defense for the doctors who risked their lives daily walking among the dying. One popular amulet was inscribed with the phrase abracadabra in a triangular pattern, a magical formula people believed could literally make the disease disappear. It's strange but true, plague doctors combined protective gear, primitive science, and medieval magic in their fight against one of history's deadliest diseases. Most didn't survive long. Despite their terrifying outfits and best efforts, most plague doctors didn't survive long on the job. Even with their beaked masks, leather gloves, and protective robes, they were constantly surrounded by infected patients, contaminated air, and unsanitary conditions. They entered overcrowded homes, touched dying bodies, and even performed autopsies without any real protection from bacteria or bloodborne infections. Over time, the very tools they used for protection would become contaminated, turning their suits into walking death traps. With no vaccines, no antibiotics, and no real treatment options, it was only a matter of time before many fell victim to the same plague they were trying to fight. Some cities had to hire multiple plague doctors in a single year because the previous ones kept dying or mysteriously vanishing. Proof that behind the beak was often a doomed and forgotten hero. They were sometimes hired as witnesses to last wills. In many towns, plague doctors were also expected to act as official witnesses for last wills and testaments. Since they were often the last people to see the dying, they had a legal role beyond medicine, recording a person's final words and confirming deathbed declarations. This made them part doctor, part scribe, and part legal authority. Imagine treating a dying patient, then being handed a quill to document who gets the family goat or plot of land. These grim duties added to the emotional weight of their job, and sometimes sparked disputes, as desperate families challenged the validity of wills made under the shadow of death. Some were paid with room and board in quarantine zones. Not all plague doctors were wealthy or well-connected. Many were desperate men who took the job out of sheer necessity. And instead of receiving proper payment, some were paid with room and board, right inside the quarantine zones. Cities would offer them housing in or near the most infected neighborhoods, claiming it was fair compensation for their service. But this so-called reward came with a deadly price. They had to live, eat, and sleep among the dying, day and night, with no real escape from the disease. Their homes were often near plague pits or isolation wards, meaning every breath they took was filled with danger. For many, accepting the job was less a career move and more a slow, inevitable march toward death. Some of these compensated plague doctors were even locked inside the city walls during outbreaks, unable to leave until the plague passed, or until they did. And that's a wrap on our journey. If you learned something new today, don't forget to like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments. Which of these facts creeped you out the most?